I would like to start this presentation by just clearly stating that I believe that in Scotland today there is a crisis in sudden death. As a nation, we have greater levels of sudden avoidable death across a broad spectrum of causes, and nothing highlights this more than the number of drug-related fatalities. Within this presentation, I'm going to attempt to show that the way we investigate, the way we use data, and the lack of effective scrutiny prevents us effectively learning from these tragedies. This also impacts our ability to reduce the number of deaths. I will also propose a way we can change and bring family participation to the forefront of change. Just recently, as of Monday, the 1st of April, Paul Johnson, the head of Public Health Scotland, has called for a preventative approach to tackle the decline in the nation's health. He states that people in Scotland die younger than any other Western European country, and overall health is declining. I think what we're going to touch on here will be a subset of what Paul Johnson's talking about, and I think with changes we can contribute to that improvement. So this analysis has come about through the development of a broad understanding of the collective views of our families. We have been through the entire gambit of sudden death investigation, FAIs and the entire complaints procedures. We find them appalling, but they do raise important questions not only of homicide, but of sudden death in general. Our starter for looking at management of death investigation came from our individual loss and the lack of care by authorities. The ultimate result of discussion and research points to a very simple formula for potential strides forward. These are simple words, but each part highlighted carries significant change required in our society. We need public reviews, a focus on prevention of future cases, and with families at the heart of the review. These are changes that most democratic 21st century facing countries already aspire to, and actually have in place. But strangely, we not only fail to have the aspiration, we seem to take great effort to stifle the conversation. This is a simple profile of our findings. It shows a system that rewards failure over success, and is designed to fail and lead to false expectations of exceptionalism. Here what we see is, if we fail to investigate incompetent investigations and corrupt investigation, there can be no crime. And if you have no crime, you have improved metrics. In this slide, we're dealing with the comments from Police Scotland that they have 100% closure in all homicide cases. How do we have 100% closure despite the fact that there is only an 80% conviction of prosecuted cases? This seems like a very brazen self-assessment. All of which places greater questions on the quality of the investigation. If we can get it wrong on the ones we are certain about, what about the uncertain cases? It cannot be that credit is taken just because a named suspect is given. These are the deaths that require significant comprehensive investigation. What does this mean for deaths that only get cursory investigations, for those that get next to none? Looking through our records, I think there are some key dates for significant change in how we've investigated deaths in Scotland and how we record them. And here are some captured here. As we move on, I want just to serve as a reminder that the focus of our families as a group was the criminal aspect of sudden death. And I want to start here to bring some points to the fore before moving into other significant areas of concern. When we consider that Police Scotland were proclaiming their significant success in identifying the murders in our society, it seemed worthwhile looking at the data for homicide and how we both use and interpret. This chart shows homicide in Scotland as a 5-year moving average. This gives a very strong impression of a steady improvement over an extended period. This in turn gives great comfort to public at large, and in general, I believe there has been an ongoing improvement. This appears to be supported in the reduction in reported violent crime. If we now look at the previous data annually rather than the 5-year average, and we apply statistical limits to that run rate, we see a very clear change occurring. The limits set here are the yellow and grey lines based upon the homicide rate and variance since 2012. This sets limits of where we would expect 99.7% of results to fall within. It is clear that the results before 2012 run at a completely different level of expectation. This is before Police Scotland actually came into being. When analysing the data pre-2012, it itself has limits that would exclude post-2012 results from being expected, so something significant has occurred in that time frame. We know that SFIU was set up fully in 2012, but there is a change from about 2008, and we will explore that before looking at the change in 2012. Before we go on to the next section of data, I would like to just go over this recent comment by an ex-serving officer in connection with how a homicide is decided. He was given some kind of insight based upon the recent shooting in Perthshire, which was a strange thing in itself. But as you can see here, he talks about having a situation where an individual was repeatedly hit over the head with objects and ultimately had their throat cut. And because a pathologist could not identify the injury that was ultimately fatal, this wasn't a homicide. So what was it? It would seem that the only place this could be recorded is suicide or accident, as possible homicide is not a metric. This becomes an important point as we progress through the data. It is worth noting that in the cases of Annie Borgerson, Annie Davies, Stephen Sutherland and Colin Marr, their deaths were written off before any investigation took place. Yet as each family got expert advice, they were in direct conflict with police and fiscals. In fact, Annie Davies' case, her death was examined by 43 experts at a seminar, and they unanimously agreed that she was murdered. As we had seen in the earlier slide, there was a steep reduction in homicide prior to the full setup of the SFIU in 2012. And these comments from this officer highlight a concern relating to what was part of that reduction. Throughout the years, there are a number of changes in how we record death, how we measure cause, and who is involved. Does this matter? In assessing the importance, it's essential to bring into account the view of the ex-senior officer and the importance of pathology in cause of death. If we look at drug fatalities as a very significant cause of sudden death, we see an important change in requirement on how to assess the cause of death as accident, self-harm, and homicide. This was a question that was rightly asked of a pathologist. In 2008, this was changed and the pathologist was no longer required to make that assessment. As we can see from the ex-police officer from Paisley, and taking the importance also raised by ex-head of West Yorkshire CID, they both see the criticality of pathology. And yet, this seems like a very serious and significant step away from ensuring the fundamental integrity of an investigation. We will now look at how this has affected data for drug homicides. We should also be asking what the consequences are for suicide versus accident figures if we no longer need pathology views. Very simply, homicide by drugs is virtually removed as a cause of homicide. If it is not reduced by this removal of expert pathology opinion, what caused it? The fact that the pathologist is not asked to record their opinion on any cause of death must raise questions beyond just that of homicide. How are we assessing the cause of death? How can we stop deaths occurring if we are not attaining the best insight into the cause? This does not explain the size of drop in 2008 or 12, but explains a fair bit. The singular greatest change in reduction of homicide comes from a vast reduction in deaths from sharp force instruments. We can see that in the 9 years up to 2012, there was 470 recorded deaths due to this, and this reduced to 274 in the 9 years following. This is a major commendable drop. We have had stop and search and change in law for possession of a knife. I think that hospital admissions support that there has been a drop. The concern I have, it is from our family's personal experience as well as from the data. We see that while there has been a significant drop in homicide, there is also a significant rise in suicide under the same cause of death. Why would we see a reduction in homicide at the same time as a rise in suicide? The drop of 30 homicides in 2012 were driven by a reduction of 21 sharp force homicides. It's interesting that in 2014, sharp force injuries increased again by 11, but there was no noted increase in homicides occurring. From our perspective as a family, if Colin Marr could have been deemed a suicide when he stabbed through the sternum, anyone's death could be. As we have seen, at the very same time as we have seen the reduction in homicides for sharp force injuries, we see that self-inflicted deaths have taken an upward trajectory to the point where we should be concerned. It has to be noted that the upward trajectory begins in 2012. We really need to know why would homicide by sharp force injury be so stable and self-inflicted be constantly increasing and going out of control. In fact, for the first time ever, as best I can see, we now have more suicide by sharp force injury than homicide. The most disconcerting thing about this rise in self-inflicted sharp force injuries, it is in serious conflict with historical expectations. In the past, the number of homicides to self-inflictions was about 4 to 1. And now we are recording more self-inflictions than homicide. What's changed and why has it changed significantly from 2012? It is worth noting that in the cases of Annie Borgerson, Stephen Sutherland, Annie Davis, Kevin McLeod and Colin Marr, their deaths were ruled suicide or accidental with no investigation taking place. In fact, COPFs instructed police to open homicide investigations in the case of Kevin and Colin, and yet the police chose not to. There were no repercussions for this failure to act, and in fact, the previous failings hidden for some time. This was a failing of senior officers. It's interesting that by contrast, a young officer in Airdrie was jailed for failing to arrest a suspected burglar, but it seems it's okay for senior officers to do nothing about a potential homicide. This quality of investigation or lack of is something we will come back to. In this section, I'm going to have a look at the shift in metrics and how it may affect other categories for cause of death other than homicide. I'm going to ask the question, is it possible that things are not improved to the extent we are led to believe? And is it possible that numbers are being moved across cause of death categories? It may seem a bit over the top, focusing on the depth and quality of investigation, but this is at the root of how we understand cause of death and ultimately how we can affect change. This simple model shows how we should expect to see a growth in how we develop data to ultimately drive actions based upon absolute knowledge. If we build the depth of knowledge to truly understand what is going on, we would surely develop the wisdom to know how to make concrete changes. In analysing sudden death, we see that our understanding builds from the source of data from the assigned cause of death. That source of data needs to be robust for our conclusions to have any meaning. It therefore must be remembered that it is the quality and decision-making of the investigation into the death that allows us to provide single data points. If that investigation lacks thoroughness and effective scrutiny, it significantly affects our understanding and our ability to make meaningful interventions. We do have lots of data, but is it robustly developed? Is it easy to use? Is it definitive enough to help active decision-making? And who acts upon it? The fact that we are missing important changes of death in society and failing to take responsive actions to correct them should be an alarm that something is wrong. I think the changes being made in cause of death assessment can be viewed through this very simple model. If we reduce the intelligence and the quality of data being introduced into our understanding of cause of death, we seriously impact our ability to act appropriately. Therefore, at the heart of this, the quality of an investigation and the thoroughness is actually the core to all our learning and being able to make change in our society. Not all of the sudden deaths worth looking at lie within the homicide and suicide categories. The numbers of accidental deaths is also alarming and showing that it is out of control with no perceivable intervention. As we had seen earlier with homicide, we can use statistical limits to keep us aware when a change of significance occurs. And again, we need to look at the upper and lower lines in this case, where it's the green and the purple. These are where we would expect 99.7% of all numbers to lie within. We can see that numbers can and will rise and fall, and we should not be overcritical or over praiseworthy with a short-term directional shift, positive or negative. However, we see that using dynamic data, these statistical limits, we should have been forced to intervene to understand what had changed and taken place some 9 years ago. Whatever is thought of this analysis, there is undoubtedly a significant increase in sudden deaths across a broad spectrum of causes. What is alarming is that suicide and drug deaths and accidental deaths are part of our social justice and do not get the same focus or resource as criminal justice receives. What is also of interest is that the number of fatal accidents appears to coincide with the introduction of the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit in 2012. Why would accidents shoot up with a perceived improved focus on investigation? We can see that accidental poisoning, i.e. drug deaths, accounts for a significant shift in accidental deaths. However, again, we see numbers growing in one category and reducing in another. Why should accidental deaths increase as suicide is reduced? The concern is that but this movement to accidental death by poisoning from suicide in turn may reduce the focus and acknowledgement in the scale of mental health deaths we have in Scotland. Also, by having a swamping of accidental death by poisoning, approximately from 17% to 50%, we can mask any underlying increase in other categories within accidental deaths that might not be getting the attention required. Underlying accidents grew from approximately 1,200 to 1,400 in this same time frame. When we look further into accidental deaths, we see that the deaths from falling has grown rapidly over the last decade or so. If we look at this in some detail, there appears to be a shift up in 2008 to 2012, then steady growth thereafter to a new levelling from about 2017. It is interesting that this is in fact a reversal of the homicide profile. It appears we are seeing significant shifts in allocation of cause of death in the very same time profiles across a broad front. The most important aspect of this is that we have another cause of death that should be getting serious focus and that an issue should be getting addressed. We have already seen that suicide for self-poisoning has been reducing, and this undoubtedly has played a significant role in their overall suicide numbers stabilising, and in fact showing a slight decrease overall. You should bear in mind that, like homicide, this was another area that had incredible media focus around 2010. What we're seeing is the reduction in suicide by poison reflected in the overall numbers dropping, but masking another area of consistent growth. That is underlying suicide for other causes. With drug deaths removed, it is growing, but being hidden by the apparent movement of death from one category to another. We can see that the numbers appear to be shifting from one category to another, and yet have the same underlying cause of death. This is disconcerting as we can miss the significant changes that are taking place, and the scale of a problem may be much bigger than we first thought. It is also concerning that we can shift cause of death from groups that have greater emotional support from society into other groups that definitely do not have that same public angst. And for that, I would say that's drug deaths. I want to take this analysis a step further and look at the changing face of drug deaths and examine the changes in the numbers as they are recorded year on year. This allows us to question why so little has been done when it is clear there have been more than one significant kick-up in fatalities. Therefore, this is another look at the impact of drugs, but this time we are again looking at drug deaths. The important part here is that we are now applying statistical control lines and are considering the data in both a dynamic and simultaneously statistical meaningful form. Using these control lines based upon relatively stable period prior to 2006, it should have forced us to ask questions in 2006 about the increase we see in deaths. And we would know for definite there's a problem in 2007. This would appear an earlier warning signal of change than any analysis we have seen from this period. For us to be effective, however, we need to have an understanding of statistical meaning, but more importantly, possess the leadership with accountability that actually makes a difference. It all starts with the questions raised, but we need to have the anxiety to be worried about this development and have someone tasked with fixing it. And if we look when the narrative develops to raise questions on sudden death issues in Scotland, it is inevitably years after the problem begins to escalate. Not only does this lead to thousands of deaths, but we need to consider that many are probably preventable. We need to understand that our behaviour also grows to accept the status quo. It's sad that when we get to around 1,200 deaths a year, we end up just seeing this as a norm, and we lose sight of the individuals and the families who have been impacted by this. This needs to change. I think it's worth noting, at the same time as data showing a statistical change in 2006, a member of public raised concern via petition to Scottish Parliament. Again, they seem to be presumptive that they already knew what they were doing. And I wonder if someone had actually taken care to actually push for this review, could we have actually been in a position we could have made changes way back then? It seems typical of the petitions. They're just a sounding board and allowing people to vent, and they take no action. There's so little care in the government for death in general in Scotland. And I think this one epitomises that. I just wanted to use this chart to show once again that we have a move from suicide to accident. I have to stress again that it's hard to find any outrage or concern for accident in comparison to our feelings for suicide. In this chart, we see that again, as one category of sudden death goes up, the other goes down. Very little change in the overall numbers taking place, but a change on emphasis, the reviewing the numbers. The numbers are genuine. You should be asking what happened around 2008 to reduce one and increase the other. We're now looking at how suicide is recorded within a single region over the window that the SFIU is set up. We're moving from having uncertainties about cause of death to being very certain. Again, our families know from personal experience that it is incredibly easy to have a death signed off as suicide. And this says that it has been done with greater certainty. Has there been a genuine change in investigation capability? Is this simply just a decision to record in a specific way? In this final slide of this section, I want to focus on the first three causes of sudden death: drug deaths, falling, and self-infliction, and really use these to emphasise the crisis we have for sudden deaths in Scotland. In 2010, we had 1,525 deaths for these three categories. By 2020, we're up to 2,955. That's an increase of 1,430 deaths per year. If we could only cut the growth in these deaths in total by about 50%, we could save over 700 lives a year. Up to now, we have looked at our escalating sudden deaths across a number of different categories. The cause of our failure to act obviously lies in the realm of government. I believe that we have been historically and systematically set up to fail. Here we will look at how our organisational setup is an obstacle for learning. In this slide, we're looking at the interrelationship between structure, culture, and capability. This entire presentation was really started after Police Scotland stated that they had 100% closure on homicide. This is a performance issue born from a culture allowed to develop in an inadequate structure. This is misplaced accountability. Leadership is obviously the key driver for success, but what happens when the structure gives the wrong leader in the wrong position the responsibility? I do believe that ownership for sudden death resides in the wrong location today, and with the best will in the world, it will not deliver the results required. We know that the Crown Office, Procurator Fiscal Services, and the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit are responsible for investigating sudden deaths. In our case, when focusing on suicide, accident, and homicide, when you look at the core focus of their organisation, it is about serving their core function of prosecution and very little else. In doing this role, they evaluate and investigate in excess of 10,000 deaths per year. Even though there is a clear understanding that public's attitude is changing to how we review sudden deaths, we see that fatal acts inquiries are at 0.7% of the total of the sudden deaths. This is the lowest level of public testing in our history. FAIs are our nation's only attempt, save a few public inquiries, at pretending to understand and learn from any of the sudden deaths. We can see by the number of FAIs we have, it is such a trivial treatment of such a serious issue. We only have FAIs where it is deemed we have something to learn. We have some of the poorest death statistics and have the lowest public inquiry levels in the English-speaking world. We will have to ask, why do we learn nothing? As stated, in Scotland, we have only one rarely used vehicle for actually publicly testing the findings of cause of death. This is the Fatal Acts Inquiry. Most AFAIs are mandatory cases, and others at the discretion of the Lord Advocate. Mandatory cases are things like death in custody. Later, we will briefly look at how good we are doing with this. Even in the mandatory cases, the Lord Advocate has a right to prohibit them. So in effect, every AFAI is at the Lord Advocate's discretion, not the need for society to learn or for the families to have answers. How many times do we see families asking for FAIs or public inquiries as they want questions addressed? In the very current analysis of death in custody that was developed out of Glasgow University, a detailed look at the effectiveness of FAIs was examined. We can see here, like broadly we're seeing across society at large, there is significant increases in death across a broad spectrum of areas of detention. Surely with this underlying backdrop and the fact that FAIs are supposedly mandatory, we would hope that critical lessons could emerge and learnings implemented. This report is very important as it's dealing with a large number of the FAIs that have actually taken place. Bearing in mind that FAIs look at around 0.7% of fatalities, so this gives us the best insight into how we look at sudden death in general. We can see by this analysis from Glasgow University that even today we see virtually no learning to be had from the death of individuals, and still families are not part of this system. We can see that the FAI was held and all government institutions were legally represented. In the case of Colin, we had an FAI where we had a lawyer allocated for a week before the FAI and to represent his family through the inquiry. At the FAI, the institutions that let him down, COPFs, police and pathology, all had QC representation. The person who had previously been detained as a suspect had a junior QC and a team of lawyers funded by Crown. There was an argument that the Crown wanted to win and they weighted it accordingly. In this case, luckily, we had a good lawyer and he managed to get a result that kept us a platform for moving forward. This report from Glasgow University took an even longer view of FAIs from 2005 to 2020. And I think the most dramatic aspect is that only 15% of FAIs made a finding of precaution. If we simply extrapolate to the fact that FAIs only occur for 0.7% of sudden deaths, and we only have 15% with some sort of learning, without looking at the value of the learning, this shows that we're only learning from about 0.1% of sudden deaths. That is 1 in 1,000. I'm sure there will be arguments that we learn elsewhere, but if this is not open to public testing and scrutiny, anything can be said with little value. Our increasing sudden deaths should be the only barometer to how effective we review cause of death. So how does our appalling inability to learn come about? Well, this is a very simplified version of how our system looks. I believe that police report suspected homicides and criminality directly to COPFs. If we consider investigation and findings of sudden death from 2012 onwards, we see the introduction of the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit. This unit also reports into COPFs. The problem here is that what they are ultimately testing for are cases that could be open to prosecution or some form of judicial hearing. The total view will also include deaths in hospitals, etc. Out of approximately 10,000 deaths, COPFs are really only interested in about 135 cases, i.e. 1.35% of the total. They have to take these 135 cases and merge them into their dealing with an excess of 170,000 crimes a year. Thus, COPFs have no vested interest in the other cases. However, the other excess of 9,800 deaths are where our crisis resides. Here we're looking at the comments from 2019 from the then head of SFIU, David Green. If, as he's stating, we're actually processing too many deaths, it is very likely that the organisation is going to be overworked or under-resourced. It is a simple fact of life. Corners must be cut to stay on top of investigations, or forever growing backlog of cases will result. Thus, quicker and simpler assessments of cause of death must be the outcome. This also has to be taken with the level of stress policing appears to be under today. So what would that do to the quality of an investigation? If we now look at some of the categories that I've been focused on as part of this analysis, we can see that where cops and police have responsibility, there has been a reduction in the number of deaths recorded in 2020 in comparison to 2010. This was primarily in transport fatalities and homicide. If you look at the other categories, everything increased. The areas they weren't focused on have increased, while the areas they have responsibility have improved. I think a good example of the difference in attitude can be seen through a fatal car accident. We see teams of experts arrive on the road getting completely closed until a full analysis has taken place. And this could be an accident or anything, but the attention to detail is impressive. By contrast, just last year in Fife, 2 young people were found dead in their home. One was in bed with some bruising to the face, the other was in the living room, and the house had been ransacked. This was immediately seen as a drug death scene, and it took 7 months later before toxicology results were given to the family. And this was done over the phone, not an official letter. If we go back to one of the Fiscal Service's key priorities, it was to allay public anxieties about particular deaths. Does this chart exemplify that very narrow focus? Although sudden deaths are increasing dramatically, we need to ask our question, is the quality of investigation improving? So another simple check on our ability to determine effectiveness in our investigation capability is to look at our understanding of the findings of a homicide investigation. As part of the investigation findings, the reason for the homicide is attempted to be given, i.e. jealousy, gang fight, etc. With the ever lower numbers of homicides and the ability to be sure we have the right person, surely our understanding of the drivers for homicide would have went up. In fact, the opposite has occurred. We seem to understand less than we did when we had almost double the quantity of homicides. Is this consistent with having experts, or is it consistent with just wrapping things up? Also, in conjunction with a lack of understanding for the drivers of homicide, we're seeing that the number of accidents where the cause of death is unascertained is on the increase. Again, the question has to be, does this seem consistent with greater understanding? Just as we draw to a close on the need for change and the organizational limitations we face, this chart actually shows some grim reading. It will stay like this unless we accept we have to change at the most fundamental level and join the 21st century. This chart clearly has a focus on drug and alcohol deaths, but hopefully you have seen that our problems go way beyond that. Throughout this presentation, it's really been focused on the negative. But I do believe there is a way through this, but it will take strong leadership to make it happen. And what I'd like to do in the following slides is show some of the ways that maybe we could move forward. The primary focus of COPFs and police on criminality must really be at the exclusion of other causes of death. This in itself is not the fault of the organisations, but a fault of the structure. It is right that organisations focus on their primary objectives, but we have a problem when that objective is such a small part of the overall profile of sudden deaths. Who does have responsibility for the other deaths? How else could we do this? From my understanding, the rest of the English-speaking nations have coroner's inquests. Look at the focus for England, Wales. It is on preventing future deaths and that for the benefit of the family. We do not necessarily need a coroner, but we do need some kind of public vehicle to have the same purpose. We keep hearing about progressive politics in our country, and yet so little care is actually given to those lost, other than political blame. These people and their families deserve more. This is a brief consideration of what actually takes place down south, and must be some sort of reference to the disparity in our approach. As stated, we clearly do not need to copy the coroner system, but the scale of investigation and family participation from outside the prosecution system is significant in England and Wales. The importance of understanding the circumstances of death and the possible elimination of the cause must be broader than that which is considered today in Scotland. And a very recent example was a coroner's inquest in December 19th, 2023. It was the suicide of head teacher Ruth Perry. And the conclusion was it was contributed by Ofsted inspection. And they actually put corrective action on Ofsted to look at how they dealt with teachers. I mean, this is a step beyond our everyday review of deaths. We should also consider another inquest which was held in England. The coroner criticised the probation services and the actions of the police. This has to be contrasted with the situation with Barry Dixon's family, who even after a successful prosecution in his homicide case, they have to personally chase for answers on why someone was allowed to run amok when they were on bail and curfew, and no action taken until Barry was killed. We seem to have a system that knows how to punish, but not how to learn. I know at times we have an aversion in Scotland from learning for anything from England, so I thought it'd be worthwhile to include these comments from the Irish Council of Civil Liberties from 2020. They actually like the English system. An old adage from my working days was that we needed to learn to steal good ideas shamelessly. We do have an opportunity here to create something that can make us all feel part of society, connected to our policing, and to be proud of this. We see here that even Ireland, which is a population size similar to Scotland, has 2,225 inquests a year compared to our 34 to 50 FAIs. Again, it's an example of showing that we don't care about sudden death, but we have the opportunity to change. In a recent publication from the European Court of Human Rights from August 2022, they underlined that Article 2, which is really the driver for needing FAIs, also comes into play in situations where the person concerned was a victim of an activity or conduct, whether public or private, which by its nature put his or her life at real and imminent risk. We must see that it is not only principle but morally required that we need to change, but it is essential if we want to save lives. There is a huge opportunity out there to affect change, but we need to remove the blinkers to the historic institutional behaviours we have. A byproduct of our thorough investigation system is that crimes are likely to increase and failings are likely to be found. In the short term, that gives the impression things are getting worse, but in reality, we're gaining greater insight. It takes strength and preparedness to take this step. The real reading of success or failure must come from a reduction in the total number of sudden deaths, not allowing the self-satisfying of police and cops' responsibilities. If this change is grasped, the shift in expected numbers must be communicated to prepare public. If this is not done in a timely manner, the next government or police chief will be trapped into hiding true numbers in fear of political exploitation. So after much analysis and extensive dialogue with other families and professionals, these are some of the key findings. I mean, the fundamental is Scotland does not care about sudden death. We talk about it, but caring is about action. No one is accountable for improving sudden death. The crisis extends beyond drugs. FAIs are a blind spot, a misunderstood and misleading artefact. And changing FAIs will change little. There's no substantive learning or opportunities to learn in place. And what we do see, where there is accountability, there is improvement, no matter how small. The upside is there is opportunity to change at relatively low cost. And part of that is the recognition of family needs and being involved, a need to think differently, and an increase in responsiveness to change is a simple step. So there is a crisis in death, but hopefully from this crisis we can make large steps forward. If we begin to care, we can maybe actually make changes that are meaningful. In this final slide, I just really want to put it simply of what our requirements are. We really need a system that facilitates the potential to publicly review all sudden deaths, with the aim to prevent future cases with the families at the heart of those investigations and findings. With a system such as this, one that is independent from COPFs, we should see far fewer cases than those like our families have faced. It is morally wrong that families have to fight tooth and nail to get near the truth, while organisations that should be founded upon integrity can protect themselves through lies and deception, while being beyond any reasonable accountability. Thank you.